Okay, to begin with, you've probably heard the sentence that just about every single pawn move that you make creates a weakness. Maybe it's a little over the top, but there's some truth in it. Now, let's take a look at this position, and we're just going to pretend that there are many other pieces around. It doesn't really matter which pieces. Okay, we're just going to pretend that there are many pieces around for both sides. We're going to see how each pawn move that we make can weaken our position. So let's begin with c4. And c4 is quite a reasonable move because we gain more control over the d5 square. And maybe we can pile up our pieces on the d file and attack d7. So generally speaking, d5 does look like a good move. It's not a perfect move though, because if black has a knight on c6, for example, pointing at d4, and maybe he's got a bishop on f8, and the bishop comes to c5, suddenly he's got two pieces controlling the d4 square. And unfortunately, our c-pawn has already moved, and as you know, pawns do not retreat. So that means the d4 square is rather weak. If this pawn were still here, we could go c3 and kick away whichever piece was installed on d4. So we've got to be careful. Every pawn move that we make probably does create some kind of weakness. And here, this is an example of that. Having said that, what white gains from this move is probably more important than the weakness of the d4 square. Now, in some positions, perhaps black can fix the weakness. And when I say fix, I don't mean to repair the weakness. I mean making it permanent. And black sometimes can use the aid of a pawn to fix the weakness. For example, let's pretend black goes c5, and then he's going to put his knight from b8 to c6, and then he's going to put his knight on d4. And now he's got the full support of a pawn. So it's going to be very difficult to remove that knight from d4. But then again, it's only a pawn that is supporting the bishop, or the knight, sorry. And then maybe we can go bishop b3, maybe we can go knight f3, put a rook on d1, and eventually get rid of that knight. Also, by having advanced this pawn, black has also weakened this square, this other square, and this pawn has become what we call a backward pawn on a half-open file. The backward pawn is one which doesn't have the support of other pawns. See, there's no pawn on e7 or c6, and then we can put our pawn on d6, and then that pawn is going to be defended by that pawn on e7 like forever. And on top of that, it is a weak pawn on a half-open file, which is going to make it easy for white to pile up his pieces on the d file. So I think white gains more than black does with a move like c4. Yes, potential weakness of the d4 square, but probably not too serious. Now let's look at other moves. b4. This is an ugly move because it weakens so many squares. In just one move, we've actually managed to weaken 4 squares. It's not easy to weaken so many squares with a single pawn move, but white has achieved that, and it's sad. There's no compensation here. I mean, the only reason I could justify a pawn thrust like b4 would be if black had 2 knights here, and then we're doing a knight fork, and then I guess a move b4 would be justified. But even then, being a piece down, this is such an ugly move. Okay, how about a move like a4? Well, I have to say that this is actually not a bad move. Sometimes white gains more space by advancing his pawn on the queen side to a5. Now, if we advance the pawn to a5, maybe we can continue with a6, and then that pawn is going to be pretty weak for the rest of the game. Like, if he takes, he's going to get an isolated pawn. If he doesn't take and advances his pawn, particularly in the end game, he's always going to have to watch out for a knight coming to b5 and attack this pawn. It's a problem. Also, the good news about a4 is that sometimes there are pieces here and there, and this rook needs to get into play, and we can use what we call a rook lift. We bring the rook up, and then we swing it over to the d file, maybe to the king side like this, or even here. and maybe we can use it to attack on the king side. Again, it's not a perfect move, but much better than b4, no question about it. It's got some advantages. I personally I like advancing my rook pawns, and so do other grandmasters. But it does weaken this square a little bit. Maybe black can put a piece here. Yes, we can kick it away by going c3, but when we advance this pawn, the b3 square becomes weak. So it's all like connected. Every pawn move that we make creates weaknesses. Okay, how about a pawn move like e5? Well, out of all the moves that we've seen so far, this is actually the best because it opens up this diagonal. Maybe there's a knight on f6, which we're kicking away by advancing our pawn. We also open up this diagonal, which could be useful. Also, by putting a pawn here, we're making it more difficult for black to advance his d-pawn, because if he does, maybe we can take. And if he has to take with a pawn, he's going to get an isolated pawn on a half-open file. That's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem. So e5, usually a good move. Again, nothing is perfect. That square becomes accessible now. Black could have a knight on e7, which he can put on f5 now, for example. Or maybe he can go b6 and put his bishop here, and this diagonal is wide open, and he can use it. Okay, but as I said, out of all the moves that we've seen, this gets the highest mark. It's usually a pretty good move. Maybe we can advance this pawn. Now, this pawn thrust is also not very good because we severely weaken this square. This square now is permanent outpost. Black could have a knight on c6 and put it there, for example. Maybe he's got a bishop here and he can use this diagonal, or even this other diagonal. It's going to be really difficult to advance this pawn. Black could just go d6 and fix it, make it permanent. Black is likely to end up having some rook on the e file, putting pressure on this pawn. Now, there are positions where perhaps the move f5 is justified. For example, if our next move cannot be stopped, if f6 cannot be stopped next move, then maybe f5 is justified. Also, there are other positions where perhaps we can use this diagonal or even this one. But generally speaking, not a very good move. And we can forget about advancing our pawns on the king side if our king is behind, because that means we're actually weakening our king side. Maybe queen can come over here, or a knight can end up on that square, and our king is going to become more vulnerable. We're supposed to keep our king safe, not open up the windows and let the opponent attack you. And pretty much the same thing can be said about h4. Rather pointless. I can think of very few positions where a move like this would be justified with our king on this side of the board. Not to mention that, again, black could fix that weakness on g4 by putting his pawn here. Now, if you picture a knight from f6 coming to g4, it's going to stay there for the rest of the game. Very painful, very painful. Okay, so how do we go about creating weaknesses? In our lecture today, we're going to be seeing 3 different techniques that we can use to create weaknesses. Now, we take for granted that our opponent will not weaken his position on his own, but I have to say that sometimes he does. Your opponent will weaken his position on his own out of ignorance, or perhaps because he thinks it's justified. Okay, sometimes we can create weaknesses in our own position because we get something else in return. Okay, so for example, if your opponent goes f3 and then goes g4, he's obviously weakening his king side, and the queen is going to come here, and we're going to get checkmated. I know this looks very obvious, but you will see that even very strong players sometimes make huge blunders which have to do with this diagonal. And I'll show you a couple of examples very soon. So what are the 3 techniques that we can use to create weaknesses? Number 1, we can use sacrifices. Most of the time we'll be sacrificing a pawn, and we'll be seeing some examples of pawn sacrifices to create weaknesses. In this particular case, we're actually going to sacrifice our queen. So by means of a very forceful move, If white takes back, suddenly this diagonal becomes terribly weak, and black can checkmate the white king like that. Pretty basic, isn't it? I'd say so. But let's see a more sophisticated example. This is not a very good move. You're not supposed to bring your knights in front of you, blocking your bishop. So the knight should go to c3 instead of d2. Here our bishop is blocked. Now black's going to try this crazy looking move. White's going to take it, and then black's going to put his knight over here, apparently attacking the pawn. Now, of course, we don't want to hang on to the pawn by going f4, because look at that square now. All black needs to do is put his knight there, and then the queen is trapped. So this knight does look a little bit annoying, and what white is going to do now is h3. Trying to get rid of this knight, because, if a knight is close to your king side, it's nobody wants to get rid of it, Unfortunately, this move is a huge blunder, which loses the game like immediately. And no, we're not talking about knight takes pawn, and no, we're not talking about knight takes f2, and no, we're not talking about queen to h4. We're talking about this move, knight to e3. The game is over, because the queen is under attack, and if we take it, we create this weakness and we get checkmated again. All right, very nice, very simple. Now, how about a top grandmaster like John Mann, the grandmaster from the United Kingdom, playing against another super grandmaster rated 2600? Let's take a look. Okay, this is a little bit more sophisticated, but okay, in this variation, black tries to put a knight here so that when we take it, he doesn't have to double up his pawns. So white now plays this move. And yes, one of the ideas is that after h6, again, we can put a knight there. Lucky for black, the pawn is on c6 and not on c7, or else knight e6 would win the game immediately. Check, bishop d2, and now queen to b6. So black is thinking, if now he takes my bishop, which is one of the fundamental ideas of knight e6, then he's going to take back, and suddenly these two pawns are under attack. This is what black had in mind. He thought he was doing okay. But John Nunn didn't take on f8. He simply put his bishop here. And when black looked at this position, he thought, okay, he's trying to sacrifice a piece because he's going to get positional compensation. He's going to go pawn takes. He's going to bring his bishop here. My king will not be able to castle anymore. And he's just going to play this position. He's going to castle. He's going to put his rook on e1, attack this pawn. He's got really good compensation. Positions like these have been played many times before. Unfortunately, that's not what John Nunn had in mind. When black took this pawn, he was completely lost in just two moves. Two moves from this position. Would you believe it? A grandmaster rated 2600 has weakened this diagonal, and he's now lost in two moves. And this is not a blitz tournament or a rapid chess tournament. Like, nowadays they published all these rubbish games, the games that are played in 1 minute, and they, someone blunders their queen. And no, this was the Linares tournament, one of the strongest tournaments in the world. And, it's a slow game. They could think for 2.5 hours for 40 moves, and yet this is the position they got. And here, instead of bringing his bishop here, what John Nunn did is he brought his queen here, forcing the king to move to d8. And suddenly, look at this diagonal now. All white needs to do is put his bishop on an a5, supported by his queen. And yes, the 2600 rated grandmaster didn't see this. All right, let's move on. So what is a weakness? Well, A weakness is basically a positional defect in your position that your opponent can take advantage either quickly um, or after a while. Okay, your opponent will have a realistic expectation of exploiting that weakness. If your opponent cannot take advantage of that weakness, maybe it's not a weakness. It's a little bit like if you watch The Simpsons. Lisa Simpson likes to think about things, and one of her sentences. Well, it's not hers because you've probably heard it before. Is, does a tree make noise when it falls down in the forest if there's no one there to hear it? I don't know. It's difficult to say. Well, same thing with weaknesses. Is it a weakness if your opponent has no way of exploiting it just because it looks ugly? Maybe not. If your opponent has no way of exploiting it, perhaps it's not a weakness. In this particular case, the pawn on h7 is definitely a weakness because it's fairly easy to attack and very hard to defend. White's going to bring his rook over here, and now he's going to move his rook over here and attack the pawn really quickly. For example, faced with the threat of rook here, he tries to put his rook over here and defend it, but we just go here, here, and here. And that's all it takes to win that pawn. And later on, when the rooks come off, maybe White's just going to advance his pawn. He's going to have a pass pawn in the endgame and a huge advantage. So isolated pawns are often weak, but not always. Okay, this is an isolated queen pawn, and it is true that in the endgame, this pawn is easy to attack and difficult to defend. See, he has no pawns next to it to defend him. There's no pawn on e6. There's no pawn on c6 to defend him. So he's got to take care of his own or rely on the aid of other minor pieces. But the problem with defending your isolated pawn with minor pieces is that those pieces become passive because they can't do anything else other than defend. So having a weakness is often a problem. However, normally with the isolated queen pawn, your opponent will get compensation. Like maybe he'll have a bishop on this diagonal, which could be threatening. Maybe your opponent will be able to put a knight on e4, and e4 is actually a very good square for the knight. Maybe your opponent will have rooks on d8 and c8, and then he'll be able to do the pawn break with d4, and black's pieces will be perfectly ready for the transformation of the pawn structure when the pawns come off. Maybe your opponent will have a bishop on b7, and then the pawn will advance. And then, this bishop will become really powerful. And at this point, you're going, yeah, but that's a lot of maybes, and a weak pawn, an isolated queen pawn is always weak. Well, how about if I showed you a quick game by one of the strongest grandmasters in the world at the time? He was actually the world champion. Let me show you. This is a game played by Karpov. Karpov was playing black. So as you can see, Karpov has given white an isolated pawn. The pawn cannot be protected by other pawns. He needs the aid of pieces, like this, or even like this. But let's see what happened. So black's trying to gain control over the d5 square with those pieces and the pawn. He's got 4 pieces controlling d4, and he's actually going to bring another one. And now he's got no less than 5 pieces controlling that pawn. So you'd probably be right in thinking that, black's got total control over that square. He's going to put a knight there. He's going to block the isolated pawn, and black's going to be doing just fine. However, white now went d5, and this position is now completely lost for the world champion. There's nothing he can do. Absolutely nothing. For example, if he takes, which is what he did, pieces come off, And if he takes again, he's going to take on e7. And when he takes back with the queen, he cannot take back with the knight because the knight is pinned. And then we're just going to trade off. And the pawn on e6 remains pinned. So Karpov resigned a couple of moves later after d5. He was completely lost. Okay, so let's not judge positions just based on the fact that one side has an isolated pawn or a pawn that looks weak. A lot of the time, a pawn will be weak if depending on the activity of your other pieces, whether your other pieces can create threats or whether you have dynamic compensation for that weakness. It's not as simple as saying, okay, this pawn is isolated, therefore it's weak, and I must be better. Okay, it doesn't work like that. Okay, it's a first step, yes, when it comes to evaluating a position, whether the pawn structure, there's any problem with the pawn structure, absolutely, that's going to be the first step. But we have to take into consideration other ideas, the activity of the remaining pieces. All right, let's move on. In this particular case, doubled isolated pawns are usually terrible. White's just going to put his bishop here, and in this position, the two minor pieces are much stronger than the two rooks, mainly because of those pawns and these isolated pawn. This pawn cannot be protected. White's just winning this position. It's completely winning. But let's see this variation in the Caro-Kann. Black not only gets double pawns here, he also gets an isolated pawn. However, he gets what we call dynamic compensation. In return for this isolated pawn and those double pawns over here, he gets a half-open file, which he can use to attack white on the king side. Most of the time in this variation, white actually castles king side. He castles on this side of the board. Okay, sometimes he can use these isolated pawns to advance it and improve his attacking chances on that side of the board. And these pawns, they're not isolated, they're part of a small pawn island, and those pawns actually help each other. Okay, they can take care of each other, they're autonomous, they don't need the aid of minor pieces to protect them. They can take care of each other. Okay, they're part of a small island. The bigger the island, the better. Okay, those pawns are not isolated. Okay, it's not like if the pawn on e7 didn't exist. The pawn on e7 does exist. Now let's see an example of a game by Bobby Fischer where he was playing black, and he actually gets triple pawns, triple isolated pawns, and yet his position is actually winning. Never mind the opening. I know we could talk a lot about the opening. Fischer is playing black, and this is the Najdorf variation. So he gets the opportunity to advance this pawn, but then his opponent goes g5, threatening to take, and this pawn is on. So we have to go d4. He's going to take, castles, we're going to take. Now he trades queens, brings his knight here, and then he takes here. And now Fischer now has triple pawns. However, this position is already winning for him, because those pawns control so many key squares in the center. And this pawn on e3, far from being a weakness, is actually an asset. It's very difficult to win this pawn for white. We can defend at any time or pin whichever piece takes on e3. We've got those pawns on e5 and e6. We can use them to support the knight coming to d4. Fischer won very quickly from this position, and if you put this position in if you try to assess this position, if you try to evaluate this position using a chess engine, the engine will say that black is already winning. Okay, so again, let's not judge positions based on the pawn structure alone. Think about the rest of the pieces, how active the other pieces are also. I have to tell you that understanding weaknesses and finding weaknesses in a position is something that comes with time. The better you get at chess, the more weaknesses you're capable of finding in the position. There are many types of different weaknesses, many types of weaknesses. And the better you get, the more capable of finding them you'll become. Okay, it takes a lifetime to improve your understanding of the concept of weaknesses. It's a very complicated one. So sometimes a weakness will not be a physical weakness, like a pawn or a bishop, which is bad because it has very few squares to move to, or it's been blocked by your own pawns. Sometimes it'll be abstract concepts, like your opponent has the initiative on this side of the board, or your king is not entirely safe on that side of the board, or maybe one of your pieces doesn't have much of a future, even though it seems to be well centralized. So understanding weaknesses takes a long time to master. Okay, the better you get, the more weaknesses you'll be able to find in a chess position. Okay, so okay, we're going to skip that because we haven't got all that much time. This is a well-known position in the Maran variation of the Queen's Gambit. Now, black plays this move, threatening to take this pawn, so white's going to advance. And now we're going to castle, and then he's going to take, because if we take here, he can take on e5, and it's a free pawn. So normally white plays this move, rook to e1, and later on captures the pawn back on d4. But in this position, white now decided to take here, sacrificing his pawn. And this is one of those pawn sacrifices that I'm talking about. Sometimes we sacrifice material in order to create a weakness. In this particular case, white sacrificing the pawn, his e-pawn, for a very good reason. The position of the black king. Black's king is going to be stuck in the center for quite a while. Because now we can deliver a check. The knight has to retreat. And then we can put our rook here, but this move is also very strong. Queen to h5, it's a very interesting idea. And so is rook to e1. These are the two variations. Now, the king is stuck in the center, and surprisingly, and that's a compensation that white has for this position. This is the type of weakness that I was talking about. It's not a physical weakness. It's not like when you have a weak pawn. It's the king that it's weak. It's the position of the king. The fact that black's development is poor. The fact that it's going to take him a while to get all of his pieces out. And if black now makes a move like bishop e7, he's going to be in trouble already. White has ideas such as, in this position, I think he can actually play rook takes. It's a very interesting possibility, with a knight coming here, attacking here, and bringing the queen here. That's one of the possibilities in this position. Or in positions like this, I believe this move is also very strong, because now if you move your queen, I think white has this interesting sacrifice with the queen, and then we take on e7. It's a very difficult position, because this knight remains pinned. I believe white can go, oops, not 95 in this position. Maybe the sacrifice is a little too much in this position. I think we would probably just go knight takes, and this one remains pinned for a while. We've got moves like bishop to c4, bishop to f4, and the knight on d7 remains pinned. So a very difficult position, and this is the type of pawn sacrifice that I'm talking about. How do we go about creating weaknesses? Sometimes we'll sacrifice a pawn. This is what Anatoly Karpov played in one of his games against Kasparov. White now played f3, and white was hoping for pawn takes, knight takes, and then later on, white's going to advance his central pawn mass. He's got 4 pawns in the center, and white's got the 2 bishops as well. But instead of that, Karpov came up with a pawn sacrifice. He actually went e3. So he's using a pawn sacrifice to create weaknesses. And when we take, those 2 pawns will be extremely weak. So that's the technique number one, sacrificing pawns or pieces in order to create weaknesses. That's the first technique. What is the second technique? Exchanging pawns or pieces to create weaknesses. Take a look at this position. Now black's going to go h6. So what are we going to do? We're going to exchange. Because now when the pawn captures, we're going to take on d5. He's going to take back. And look at what's happened. Those pawns are a mess. They're terrible pawns. These two pawns are isolated and weak. Doubled, isolated. This one's isolated. This is the square on f5 is weak because it cannot be protected by a pawn. This is a terrible position for black. And all we've done is exchanged some pawns and pieces. Very simple. Bishop takes. He cannot take with the queen because then we win this pawn. He's got to take with the pawn. And then if we do not exchange here and we make a pawn move like this, then maybe black's going to go here. And now when we trade, his pawns are okay. Those pawns, it's a small pawn island. It's very hard to take advantage of this pawn. Yes, black's got some compensation because he's got the two bishops. Okay, but in the initial position when we trade, the two bishops do not compensate the defects of black's pawn structure. Okay, in this position, it's difficult to see a weakness, to find a weakness in black's position. Yet, world champion Mikhail Botvinnik found a very simple idea. He thought, if I manage to trade off this bishop for my bishop, then the c6 square is weak. So he actually played knight to d4. And then after bishop takes, bishop king takes, you can tell that square has become weak. That's all it takes sometimes to create a weakness. Trade off the pieces which defend the squares which you wish to invade. It's as simple as that. Later on, Botvinnik went on to play b5, and he made the weakness of c6 permanent. And this is interesting because the moment that he went b5, yes, he did fix the weakness of the c6 square. He did give away, like the moment that we advance this pawn, like let's pretend he does this and we advance here, and that square is going to be, that square belongs to white forever now. But we are conceding the c5 square. This is something that you have to come to terms with. As you become a better player, you will realize that your opponent will give away nothing. So a lot of the time, you're going to have to trade. You're going to have to make concessions. You'll give something away, but you will get something in return. And quite often, it'll be more valuable than what you're giving away. That's what makes chess so hard. Evaluating whether what you're giving away is worth more than what you're gaining. But when you play against someone you're on level or someone stronger, it's always going to be like that. Do not expect to get what you want all the time. It doesn't happen unless you play against someone who's much worse than you, and then you're probably going to win either way. Okay. All right. So let's move on. And this is a game. So we've seen exchanging as the second technique to create weaknesses. What is the third technique? The third technique is very interesting because what we do is we create simple threats that force our opponent to make a pawn move, and then a weakness has been created. Take a look at this position. And I know, yes, white is winning because it's got a queen and two bishops. But let me show you how this technique works. We're just going to bring our queen to g4 and threaten checkmate. A very simple threat. Do we expect black to leave his pawn there? No, we know he's going to advance that pawn. But the moment that he does, look at this weakness now. And all we need to do is queen here, and the game is now over. So this technique is one of the most effective ones. You create a simple threat. Your opponent is forced to make a pawn move, and then you take advantage of that newly created weakness. Let me show you a grandmaster game where he used this fantastic technique. This was a 2300 rated player, and this was a slow game. Now in this position, black now went b6, which is not a very good move because it kind of feels like black's making too many pawn moves. He's not really doing very much. And now white puts his knight there, and he's threatening to bring his knight to d6, supported by his queen. If black were to trade his bishop for this knight, then black's dark squares would become terribly weak. And that would make this bishop a formidable piece. Maybe we'll develop it here, or perhaps, whoops, not b4, I meant b3, and then bishop a3, if the bishop comes off. So black's going to go d6. And black's position looks pretty solid. But here, black's in big trouble already. White's going to make a very simple threat. He's going to bring his bishop to f4, attacking this pawn. This pawn cannot advance, because look at that square. How is he going to defend this pawn? He's going to have to move this one. And that's exactly what white wanted. He thought, okay, I'm going to put my bishop there, and now he's going to be forced to advance his pawn. But now look at that square. That square has become terribly weak. Now, who protects this square? This knight. Now we revert to the exchanging technique. We get rid of the pieces which control the pieces which defend the squares that you want to occupy. So we bring our bishop here. And black's in big trouble already, because after bishop e7, the game was already over after simply bishop takes f6. He cannot take back with the bishop because of knight takes pawn, or because of the move that happens in the game when he took with the pawn. And if he takes with the pawn, what do you think white should do in this position? I know most of you want to play at knight to d5, and I have to admit that that looks like a pretty good move because, you know, we're threatening knight to c7. Do not underestimate black's defensive chances. Maybe he can go knight to a6, and that square is perfectly defended. Instead, we've got a much simpler move. Queen to d5. The game is over. Now, do you know what it took to win this game? Black was no beginner. He's a 2300 rated player. The 2300 rated player in Australia could easily win the Queensland Championship, the Championship of Western Australia. 2300 is pretty high level. And he was lost in 9 moves because he didn't understand the dynamics of weakness creation by means of simple threats. Those are the 3 techniques. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. And but I hope that you've learned a little bit about weaknesses and weakness creation. Last time we did the lecture, a couple of days later, I provided a link to an online quiz and also to the video. I'll be doing the same this time around, but bear in mind that last time I think only 2 people took the quiz. I expect more people to take the quiz this time. It's a challenge. I mean, do it for yourself. I mean, you know, find out whether you've actually learned something from these lecture and from the video that I'll be sending you. You know, find out. It's no big deal. All right.
No. We will do our best, Coach.
So I don't know what's wrong with the sound today, Andrew. It's not as good as last time. I don't know why. I think, yeah.
There's been a bit of jumping in the internet, but it's still pretty good.
So, okay. Okay.
An external mic for it from our side.
We'll try and
be better, Coach. We'll try and be better next time.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, as usual, it's been a pleasure. It's been fun, and I hope my lecture was useful to you, and maybe you can do your own research on weakness creation. It's a fascinating topic. It can help you become a lot better at chess, and yeah, I guess I'll be seeing you next time.